Trump blames the World Health Organization for being too China-centric. China is using the coronavirus to split Europe, and the head of the World Health Organization badly mishandled the pandemic response. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The UK is saying millions of coronavirus test kits they bought from China don't work. And Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in intensive care for the coronavirus. So it's not that surprising that Britain is falling out of love with China. After all, the reason the world is in this mess is because the Chinese Communist Party tried to cover up the coronavirus, which made it spread worse. That's why I'm calling it the CCP virus. In case you don't know how bad this mess is, take a listen to what a World Health Organization official said on March 30th.
In most parts of the world, due to lockdown, most of the transmission that's actually happening in many countries now is happening in the household, at family level. In some senses, transmission has been taken off the streets and pushed back into family units. Now we need to go and look in families to find those people who may be sick and remove them and isolate them in a safe and dignified manner.
Yes, authorities should remove people from their homes in a safe and dignified manner, like they do in China. I mean, the World Health Organization has repeatedly praised China's response to the coronavirus epidemic, but the idea that a WHO official is suggesting that authorities should go into your home and take family members away? That kind of sums up my 2020 experience. Here's me at the beginning of 2020. Oh boy, 2020 is going to be great. And me now. The United Nations is setting up a one-world government with the Chinese Communist Party at the helm. Wake up, sheeple! Fortunately, the WHO and the UN do not have authority to go into your homes here in America. Or anywhere, really. Even in China, because China has its own people to do it. But if you've been watching the show for the last few months, you know I've repeatedly called out the World Health Organization for massive corruption. Check out my recent episode about the head of the World Health Organization, should WHO head resign over coronavirus cover-up. Even though the WHO may not have the power to separate us from our families, it is still kind of worrying that a WHO official would make that kind of a suggestion, and even more worrying that it barely made headlines. What is making headlines is President Trump calling the WHO very China-centric.
The WHO, that's the World Health Organization, receives vast amounts of money from the United States, and we pay for a majority, a biggest portion of their money. And they actually criticized and disagreed with my travel ban at the time I did it. And they were wrong. They've been wrong about a lot of things. And they had a lot of information early, and they didn't want to, they seemed to be very China-centric.
To be fair, considering how much Trump talks about China, one could argue that he's very China-centric too. But the WHO flat out rejects Trump's claim. Hey, did you know that Taiwan warned the WHO back in December that the coronavirus could be human-to-human transmissible? But the WHO didn't tell anyone. Maybe because they sided with China politically and ignored Taiwan's warnings. Anyway, Trump is now considering suspending U.S. funding to the WHO. Now, some say if the U.S. pulls funding for the WHO, that means China will completely take over. Well, China already has huge influence over the current and previous heads of the WHO, and China got the current head to help them cover up the coronavirus, but okay, China has already pretty much taken over. But if the US stops coughing up the money, I think WHO officials will care. The WHO routinely has spent about $200 million a year on travel expenses, more than what it doles out to fight some of the biggest problems in public health, including AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. And a lot of those travel expenses included first-class airfare and five-star hotels, like how in 2017, while the head of the WHO visited Africa, She stayed here in one of the most expensive hotels in Guinea. She even stayed in the presidential suite, which costs more than $1,000 a night, complete with a luxury marble bathroom. WHO officials don't want to lose that kind of lifestyle. And somehow I don't think China will pay for it. At least not when WHO officials are staying in Africa. And coming up after the break, the Chinese Communist Party is using the coronavirus to divide and conquer Europe. Welcome to China Uncensored, I'm Chris Chappell. The Chinese Communist Party is using the coronavirus to split Europe, because clearly the UK didn't do a good enough job of it back in January. From the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, the European Union is a big problem. With a combined economy bigger than China's, the EU has the power to do things like enact trade policies that apply to all its 27 member states, stop potential security risks like shady Chinese telecom company Huawei, and in general stand toe-to-toe with the world's largest authoritarian regime. Fortunately for the world's largest authoritarian regime, the global pandemic it caused by covering up the coronavirus for almost 2 months is playing in its favor. Europe is now the new epicenter of the coronavirus, or as I'm calling it, the CCP virus. Italy has more CCP virus deaths than anywhere outside China. And who are they looking to for help? China! No, that's not a joke. The drum kit just fell over. In mid-March, the Chinese government sent medical supplies to Italy, along with a medical team that stopped to pose for the media. Wow. Those guys are so professional, they don't even need 6 feet of social distancing. Lucky for Italy, they joined China's Belt and Road Initiative last year. Italy's Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio said, "Those who mocked us on the Silk Road must now admit that investing in this friendship has allowed us to save lives in Italy." There's a reason Luigi is player 2. Meanwhile, Spain, the second hardest hit country in Europe, is also looking to China for help fighting the coronavirus. After an agreement in late March, China sent millions of masks and test kits to Madrid. The Czech Republic also got medical supplies from China, and the Chinese ambassador spoke on the tarmac at a totally unstaged press event.
China stands ready to work together with the Czech Republic and other countries to fight against this epidemic together.
Same thing in Greece, where China sent an airplane full of supplies.
We are fighting this virus together as a friend, so we will do our very best to help.
Gosh, all these are such beautiful gestures by the Chinese Communist Party, lending a helping hand to all those European countries infected with the coronavirus. This delivery of face masks from China to Belgium says unity makes strength. What they mean is unity with China makes strength. That's exactly the narrative Chinese state media want everyone to believe. And the Chinese telecom giant Huawei, which has close ties to the Chinese Communist Party, recently donated 800,000 masks to the Netherlands. I wonder if that has anything to do with the fact that the Netherlands is still deciding whether to allow Huawei into its 5G network, despite the national security risk. Side note, it turns out a lot of the test kits Chinese companies sold throughout Europe turned out to be faulty and had to be returned. Anyway, a lot of European countries have been willing to accept China's generous gifts, even though some of them may have been low quality, and even though in most cases they actually had to pay for the supplies, so they weren't actually gifts. But whatever, they've still been willing to accept these supplies from China because they perceive the European Union as not doing enough. Eurosceptic populist leaders are very happy to play along with Chinese propaganda, to say only China is helping us to promote the idea of the lack of EU solidarity. Take Serbia, a country in Eastern Europe. Somewhere. For a long time, Serbia has been hoping to join the EU.
Serbia plans to join the EU by 2025. But the country's environmental procedures and greenhouse gas emissions currently do not meet the requirements.
It's tough to meet the EU's requirements. But guess who doesn't care about environmental blah blah blah? China, the world's biggest polluter. After all, true friends help each other hide their problems. The Serbian president flew to China last year to build that friendship. And China is such a good friend that on March 21st, China sent Serbia one of their propaganda teams. Medical teams, along with boxes of supplies. And Serbia's president did what any normal world leader would do. He welcomed them on the tarmac and then kissed the Chinese national flag to express his gratitude. I wonder if he regrets that now that his Secretary of State has died from the coronavirus. But the Chinese regime's overtures to help European countries is part of its plan to weaken the EU, to make individual countries turn not to each other, but to China in their hour of need. And it seems to be working. I don't see Serbia's president kissing the EU flag, even though maybe he should. The EU is helping. It just hasn't gotten as much publicity. The EU provides significant support to Serbia's hospitals and has included it in its emergency stockpile of medical equipment. Plus, Germany and France have sent shipments roughly as big as China's to EU countries like Italy, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Despite this, China is winning the coronavirus propaganda war. Many European countries have turned on each other. So with the Chinese Communist Party trying to insert itself as the savior of Europe, what can be done? Well, the European Union needs to come together and lay the blame where it really is due, the Chinese Communist Party. Remember, the CCP virus outbreak started in China and spread because of the party's cover-up. Now the CCP sends supplies to Europe and uses that to fight a propaganda war. It seems like the EU understands what's happening and is trying to counter China's propaganda narrative. But it's an uphill battle, because the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to split Europe for years. We've been looking at this issue for a long time on this show, doing episodes on China's growing influence in countries like Serbia, Greece, and Italy. It's no coincidence that these are also the countries that the Chinese Communist Party is now targeting with both their coronavirus aid and their propaganda. But these countries should watch out. Just because you're a friend of China, Italy, doesn't mean the Chinese regime won't throw you under the bus when it's convenient. In fact, Chinese state-run media are now suggesting the coronavirus may have started not in China, but in Italy. They've done that by twisting the words of Italian physician Giuseppe Ramuzzi. Ramuzzi had said in an interview that some doctors in Italy remember having seen very strange pneumonias, very severe, particularly in old people in December and even in November. Ramuzzi meant that the coronavirus might have spread from China to Italy as early as December or November. But Chinese state-run media reported it as if he meant that the virus started in Italy, not China, which he says is not at all what he meant. So now Italy, which has been the hardest hit with the CCP virus, is being blamed by the CCP for starting the virus. That's called friendship with Chinese characteristics. You never know when China's propaganda war could turn on you next. Speaking of Chinese propaganda, the head of the World Health Organization seems to eat it up. But now, people are calling on him to resign. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. As you know, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, covered up the coronavirus in the critical early weeks when it could have been stopped. They did it to protect themselves politically. But the CCP's cover-up was monumentally stupid because it led to a disaster in China and now the rest of the world. That's why I call the coronavirus the CCP virus. But it wasn't the CCP alone. They had a friend helping them along the way, the World Health Organization, and more specifically, the WHO's leader, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, this guy. And people are now calling on Dr. Tedros to resign. Side note, Dr. Tedros is not actually a medical doctor. He has a PhD in community health. Anyway, he's an Ethiopian national, and with his community health degree, he ended up working as Ethiopia's Minister of Health for 7 years and then as Minister of Foreign Affairs for 4 years before being elected as the new Director General of the World Health Organization. Now, working as a national health minister may sound like a good resume item for the next WHO director. But you know what's not? a legacy of covering up epidemics. This article from 2017 says Tedros, while Minister of Health in Ethiopia, may have covered up not one, but 3 cholera outbreaks. Outbreaks occurring in 2006, 2009, and 2011, he said, were only acute watery diarrhea. Now, it just so happens that cholera is a contagious disease that causes severe watery diarrhea, and it can kill people if it goes untreated. But hey, that's just watery diarrhea under the bridge. I mean, if Tedros is experienced at cover-ups, it makes sense why the Chinese Communist Party was so eager to have him lead the WHO. During Tedros' campaign for the WHO position, he was invited to speak at Peking University. Peking University is like the Harvard of China, but with less academic freedom, and more Asians. Tedros soon got elected as the WHO's Director General and assumed office in June 2017. And according to state-run China Daily, his very first bilateral meeting as the new head of the WHO was in China, with China's Minister of Health. Tedros used that meeting to reiterate the One China principle and to assure Chinese leaders that the WHO would properly handle the Taiwan-related issues based on the resolutions of the UN General Assembly. Properly handling Taiwan-related issues means pretending the country of Taiwan doesn't exist. And after visiting China again in August 2017, Tedros tweeted this, back from a successful visit to China, signed agreement with Minister Li Bin to increase China's voluntary contribution to the WHO by 50%. Back in 2017, China's voluntary contribution to the WHO was around $10 million. The United States' voluntary contribution that year was more than $400 million. Anyway, fast forward. By December 31st, 2019, Taiwan was already alerting the WHO that the new coronavirus was seeing human-to-human transmission. But since the WHO pretends that Taiwan doesn't exist, they ignored it. And as the weeks went by, Dr. Tedros, who is supposed to be the guy in charge of an organization that helps predict and stop global epidemics, ended up becoming the guy in charge of the global epidemic cover-up, thanks to his awkwardly close relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. That photo was taken on January 28th. They really should have been social distancing. Here's a Chinese state-run TV report about that January 28th meeting, which was more than a week after everyone already knew the outbreak in China was deadly serious.
The head of the World Health Organization says he is confident in China's epidemic prevention and control ability. Dr. Tedros Adhanom met Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Beijing today. He said the WHO and the international community recognize the decisive actions taken by the Chinese government to curb the spread of the new coronavirus, and he called on the international community to remain calm and not to overreact.
Good thing Tedros followed the Communist Party line and told the international community not to overreact. Like how in early February, he told countries that travel bans were not needed. And in mid-March, as the Chinese authorities continued to cover up how bad things were getting, even after 2 months of lockdown, Tedros tweeted his support for China, reporting no new cases. Now, I'm not saying Tedros is cozying up to the Chinese regime or his incompetence, or both, are the main reasons the CCP virus is now killing tens of thousands of people across the globe. It was ultimately the CCP's cover-up that caused it. But Tedros and the WHO absolutely played along. U.S. Senator Martha McSally, who's on the Senate Intelligence Committee, tweeted last Friday that Dr. Tedros deceived the world. At one point, he even praised China's transparency during its coronavirus response efforts, despite a mountain of evidence showing the regime concealed the severity of the outbreak. This deception cost lives. And a lot of Americans, while quarantining in their homes, are now calling on Tedros to resign from the WHO. There's also this petition on change.org calling for his resignation. It has more than 700,000 signatures. That's a lot of signatures. That puts it somewhere between this petition for a meatless option at McDonald's and this petition to make Kobe Bryant the new NBA logo. But suffice it to say, a lot of people want Tedros to step down. If he does step down, will that fix the WHO? Not necessarily. This is the previous Director General of the WHO, Margaret Chan. Before joining the WHO, she was the Director of Health in Hong Kong. In 2003, after Chan had been in that position for 9 years, Hong Kong was still ill-prepared for the SARS epidemic. SARS killed more people in Hong Kong than any other Chinese city. Good track record so far. In 2015, after she had been leading the WHO for nearly a decade, an independent report showed that the WHO was incapable of reacting to international health crises such as Ebola. The report said the WHO lacked the capacity and internal culture to mount an effective response to an epidemic. Now that's incredible. If the WHO lacked the capacity, that could be fixed with more money. But if your internal culture sucks and your leadership is bad, there's nothing you can do. But the important thing is, even though the WHO was unprepared for epidemics, under Margaret Chan's leadership, the WHO was prepared to deal with Taiwan, or as this confidential WHO memo required everyone to call it, the Taiwan province of China. But the WHO wasn't just required to refer to Taiwan as a province of China. According to this memo, if any WHO units wanted to use any documents or information from Taiwan publicly, they were required to clear it first with the Chinese permanent mission to the UN in Geneva. So good job, Margaret Chan. And guess what she's doing now after her successful stints in Hong Kong and the WHO? She's a member of the Chinese government's advisory body, the CPPCC. So the World Health Organization has had issues for a long time, not just under Tedros. Japan's Deputy Prime Minister recently said the World Health Organization should be renamed the China Health Organization. Good one. Although while the WHO has done a lot for the Chinese government, it hasn't done much for the health of the Chinese people. So the WHO has lost international credibility by repeating the Chinese Communist Party's coronavirus propaganda. But China's influence at the UN goes beyond the WHO. For years, they have been expanding their control in the UN overall, which explains how China just got appointed to a UN human rights panel where they will now play a central role in picking at least 17 human rights investigators, including those looking at freedom of speech, enforced disappearance, and arbitrary detention. What could go wrong? And that's it for this week's China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.